We have some time for questions and answers now. I think there will be a roving microphone if you want to ask a question. And following Calvin, we particularly welcome women to ask questions. So be bold. But I will start things off by asking Dr. Trueman a question. What do you think the role of the history of biblical interpretation should be for Orthodox Protestant biblical scholars today?
It's tried to say that I think it should be very important. I do think that an understanding of how the biblical text has been understood throughout church history is as important as understanding the history of doctrine itself. And clearly the two things are very closely connected. Of course, it's a vast subject. And speaking now as a pastor, not as an academic, one of the questions I would have to face, I guess, in my congregation is, how does one cultivate a knowledge of the history of interpretation in a congregation where my congregants, by and large, are very busy 5 days a week, and I get them for just a couple of hours on a Sunday. And that's where I think that things such as the Reformation Commentary on Scripture and the IVP series on the ancient commentary on Scripture.
Smooth. That's our
nice plug. Yeah. Nice plug for the family. I know. You need. But I think series like that do an excellent job in helping pastors be more aware of the history of exegesis, and hopefully allowing the more learned members of congregation, congregants with time to do this, to read up on the subject themselves. But clearly, one of the things I would be loath to do as a Protestant pastor is detach the doctrine I teach on a Sunday from the history of the exegesis of Scripture.
This question's for Dr. Zachman. It seems, as I listen to you speak about Luther, and as from what I know of Luther, it's so clear that his craving for assurance informs so much of what he does. Mm-hmm. So even as he approaches Scripture, that assurance stuff is all over the page. Mm-hmm. And then it seems also clear that with Erasmus, his humanism is in the background. Read the pagans, read with a pure heart. But I'm having a harder time pinpointing what motivates Calvin in this. And I'm wondering if maybe I missed it because it's the afternoon and that's okay. But if you have any information about what is motivating Calvin, if there is such a thing.
Oh, no, it's very interesting. Thank you for your question, because that was the thing I was struck by. I mean, he will say things like, only by the reading of Scripture can you defend yourself from Satan or from these other things that attack you. But when you read his overall picture, it's really a school. He's setting up a school in which you have teachers and students, and then the students can become teachers and the teachers can become students. And the point seems to be that tied into Calvin's larger concern that there can never be unaccountable authority anywhere, right? So you can never have a church in which one person has authority that is not being held accountable by the people to whom that person's the people whom that person is serving. So, for instance, you can't have a priest in private confession hearing the sins of the confessant where church discipline's at stake. You could have that where a conscience needs to be reassured of its sin, but in terms of anything approaching excommunication, you can't have a one-on-one situation like that because the priest isn't accountable to anyone. So you have a consistory made up of a group of pastors and elected lay representatives, and they take minutes, right? And we have all those minutes now. So no, it's amazing, actually. So the person could say, I got a raw deal. And they say, well, let's look back. May 15th, 1564, what was the charge? And they ask the person when he comes in or she comes in, do you know why you're here? Right, which is amazing. So I think I see it actually as part of his criticism of Rome is you just have this top-down authority. The only person who can correct the Pope is God, and God only tells the Pope what needs correcting, right? And then the Pope feeds the bishops, who then feed the priests, who then tell their congregations that they're too stupid to know anything for themselves. They should just listen to them. So, and it's a safer way to go. That's what Sadoleto tells the Genevans. So for Calvin, that's absolutely reprehensible. And you have what the church is teaching students to think for themselves, so that they can judge what they're hearing on their own, and also then become teachers in their own right. So in a sense, Calvin's concern is pedagogical. I mean, it's really pedagogical, but a pedagogy with regard to the proper role of authority in the church, where you have this whole community of interpretation, which also, by the way, ties in with the community of interpretation historically, because he wants pastors and also, if congregants are interested, to read older commentaries as well as contemporary ones. So, but it doesn't have quite the same telos that Erasmus and Luther do, but I think actually in another way it does. I think the contrast is, what is the book of the unlearned, right? Is it images or is it scripture? And if it's images, just stand there and show them a bunch of pictures. If it's scripture, you've got a lot of work to do, because you have to teach them how to read, right? And then you have to teach them how to read well. So I think that's actually the difference, but it's kind of interesting. He, of all the three, has this more educational model in mind, so thank you.
I was wondering if you could explain Luther's focus on being able to defend himself at his death before the devil when he is the champion of salvation by grace alone.
Yeah, you have to be an exegetical warrior. I mean, isn't it? It's amazing to me. So I did an article that never got published because they said it wasn't history, but it's puzzling to me. In my reading of Luther, like from the earliest writings we have from him through to the end, in early Luther, this theme is completely absent. You can read all the 1520 writings. It's not there at all. 1521, it shows up. It never goes away. And I'm absolutely convinced it was the Diet of Worms that did it. When Luther's standing before the emperor and all of the imperial estates of the Holy Roman Empire, I mean, that's the sum total of human authority as he understood it, and the Pope's representatives and bishops and the theologians and all of the ecclesial authority of the world gathered there, and they tell him, recant, you're completely wrong, and he won't. Whatever the words were that he did or didn't say, he didn't recant. And yet, no university agreed with him, no bishop agreed with him, and very few temporal rulers agreed with him. Only Frederick the Wise at that point, and even he didn't explicitly agree with him, and his own superior in the Augustinian hermits did not agree with him. And so then all of a sudden he's kidnapped and taken off to the Wartburg Castle, and he's living all alone, concealed as a knight. And he says that some of the worst trials he ever experienced were there, when the devil attacked him and said, the Pope says you're wrong. The emperor says you're wrong. Staupitz says you're wrong. Are you the only person in Europe who's right? Right? And he had to defend himself. Right? And one of his defenses was, I am baptized, actually. It's really interesting. So, but I think that once he undergoes that experience at the Wartburg, he becomes convinced that experience is not only going to happen during your life, and hopefully it does happen during your life, it's going to happen to all of us at the hour of our death. And he combines this experience with the book of Job and Jesus in Matthew and Luke, right? So in Job is admired by God. Says, have you considered my servant Job? And Satan, whom Luther takes to be the devil in that narrative, says, well, will he serve you for nothing? And he goes and he absolutely, with God's permission, just assaults the daylights out of Job in order to see if Job will be able to stand. And Luther sees the same thing happening to Jesus in the wilderness. He's all alone. He's fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. He's at his very weakest, and Satan attacks, right? And how does Jesus defend himself? Scripture. You shall not live by, he quotes Deuteronomy mainly. You shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from God. You shall not tempt the Lord your God. You shall worship the Lord alone and serve him. So these clear, indisputable texts of Scripture, and Satan goes away. So he has this exegetical reason what kind of strategy he thinks you should follow, but he's absolutely convinced, and he is for the rest of his life. You can read the latest things he wrote, and it's the same thing, that if the devil outmaneuvers you, you're doomed, right? If you don't know what you believe and why you believe it, and on the basis of what authority you believe it, he will pluck you like a parched leaf. Okay, so, I mean, it's absolutely, so you could say you're saved by the grace of God, but if you don't know that, and you don't defend yourself with that at the hour of your death when you're all alone and at your weakest point, the way Jesus was after 40 days of fasting, you're lost. And God has apparently agreed to the terms of this combat. So I mean, it's amazing to me to discover that Luther's whole theology is preparing you to die. It's part of the art of death spirituality. Only it's preparing you to die as an exegetical gladiator. You're going to go in there and you're going to vanquish the devil. And if you don't, you're doomed. Right? If you don't, you're doomed. It really is amazing. And he wasn't kidding. He wasn't kidding about that. So that's kind of a long excursus. It's Job, the temptation narratives of the Gospels, and then Luther's own experience at the Wartburg. And he actually thought his Roman opponents going to that did him a favor because they increased the skill with which he could answer the devil on the last day. So anyway, fascinating, I think. So.
Dr. Zachman, I don't know if this was your intent, but you have convinced me I ought to read some Erasmus.
Oh, you should.
So
Absolutely.
Where do I begin? Especially because I want to encounter many of the quotations that you gave us.
Aren't they beautiful? They're really beautiful. I mean, I was thinking actually last night, the talk last night, where you're right there, the marks there. I was just hearing Erasmus in my head the whole time. So the places I was drawing from, there are just three texts, actually. The first one is the Enchiridion, which he publishes in 1501? It goes through multiple editions, the most important of which is 1518. So the Enchiridion, the Handbook of the Christian Soldier, it's called. And then the other two were the Paraclesis, which is the call that he writes at the beginning of the Greek and Latin edition of 1516. And then the second one from that period was a 1522 forward to the third edition of the Greek and Latin New Testament. And both of those are available in a Norton anthology of Erasmus's writings called The Praise of Folly and Other Writings by Erasmus. So, and I think John Olin edited a volume of Erasmus's writings too, in which the Paraclesis is also found. But the thing about a theological life and transformation, I mean, it really is amazing stuff. And to be quite honest with you, Calvin rips him off left and right. No, he does. If anyone's interested, there's a whole dissertation and a career, Calvin and Erasmus. I am dead serious. And would that the reformers had listened to this. See, I think we are living to our regret that we read Scripture dogmatically. Sorry. It was read in this transformative way before the Reformation. Erasmus argued it should be read during the Reformation. I think personally, that's what most of us should be doing, is not reading it to judge doctrine, but really to change the way we live. Because even ultimately doctrine should lead to that, I would hope. So anyway, I hope that helps. So those are the three places. Relatively short, but really kind of succinct. So.
I'm going to get another question into Dr. Trueman so he doesn't feel so sad and lonely and lost over here.
I'm happy just standing here enjoying the view.
So Newman has a critique of liberalism as sentimental, which he then applies to evangelicalism. Yet, it was very fascinating to hear you say his apologia is one of the great conversion narratives, which is an evangelical genre, or a genre that evangelicals emphasize. And it's also a book that in lots of ways is emphasizing against personal sincerity, which is a evangelical category, arguably of sentiment, that he's trying to connect. Can you talk about the relationship between those two things?
Sure. Well, I think I'd respond to that in two ways. One, clearly Newman has some kind of evangelical phase early in his Christian life. The influence of Thomas Scott is profound on him. And I suspect, one of my friends has a statement to the effect of, you do an awful lot of your living in your first 22 years. So I suspect that patterns of thinking for Newman were laid down pretty clearly during his evangelical phase, which he probably never got out from under. Secondly, I would point to the specific context for writing the Apologia, and of course it's a response to Charles Kingsley, who has specifically called Newman out on being insincere and essentially saying, and in the Roman Catholic Church, Newman has said sincerity is not something that's to be prized. So I think there is an evangelical background to the Apologia, and I also think Newman is specifically zeroing in on sincerity because that's the point at which Kingsley has challenged him. So I would find, I would argue for, yes, continuing evangelical influence on Newman to the extent that I'm capable of commenting on that, but I would also say the specific historical circumstance is probably sufficient to explain why he's adopting this particular genre. And Kingsley is a sort of quasi-evangelical type as well, so he may well be responding to Kingsley, using a genre that Kingsley himself would have to concede is valid. But you're the Victorian guy. You would know the answer to your own question far better than me, I suspect.
Someone else?
Hi. My question is, either one of you two, I guess. First of all, I want to echo that guy's newfound interest in Erasmus. I had no idea he said those things. Anyway, I wanted to know, I'm not sure about dates on these things, but Calvin's interest in people having help and understanding scriptures and the background and so forth. Did this come from as a consequence of the Peasants' Revolt, which I know I've heard people developed an interpretation of scripture that Luther didn't expect. So I just wanted to know if that influenced other people's interpretation of things.
No, it's actually a really good question. I think actually what Calvin realizes is that the Romantic view of the Reformation was wrong, right? The Bible was always there, and everyone knew it. Luther says himself, where did I get the Bible from? The Roman Church, right? Along with the creed and a lot of other things, the sacraments and all these other things. So then the question is, well, then what went wrong? And what went wrong was the interpretation. And this is what Carl so very well brought up. When you read Newman, you realize that this is what the reformers were doing. They were doing history, right? They're looking at where did the history of the interpretation of Scripture go wrong? Where did the teaching of the church go off the rails? They thought about these things all the time, and they came up with different analyses, actually, of this. But so for Calvin, restoring Scripture, and you see this in Luther, actually, and you see it in Erasmus. Why does he write a paraclesis, this exhortation at the beginning of the book? Because you need to guide people in the way to read this text. The scholastics were citing Scripture all over the place, but Erasmus thought it was a disaster, right? So it isn't Scripture, it's how you're the framework in which you're placing it. So if you place it in the context of pagan poets and philosophers who are teaching you ethics, that's going to frame Scripture so that you look for the form of life that you're to find there and how you're to live. If you place it in speculative philosophy, you're going to come up with a totally different set of questions. So I think Luther doesn't always seem to acknowledge, although he does by writing these prefaces, that this interpretive framework is necessary. But that's usually where the rubber hit the road in terms of the polemic with Rome. The Roman Church took Luther's German Bible and published it. Emser just took it under his own name, but they stripped every preface out of it, right? So it was precisely the interpreter, the voice of the interpreter that was at stake, not the Scripture itself. And I think that's incredibly important. So who are the people that Calvin or others would want us to listen to while we're also listening to Scripture? I think that's an incredibly important issue. And one thing I'd add to the list, I wouldn't shorten the list at all that Carl's listed, but one of the other things that they did was they were reading Jewish authors. Right, they're reading Jewish interpretation from the early rabbinic period right through, and they're also reading every classical author that they could get their hands on, including the historians. So there's a whole body of literature they're assuming that you would know, not as a layperson, but as a teacher. Because again, going to your question, and it wasn't the Peasants' Revolt, it was just, from Calvin's point of view, it was just obvious that what happened wasn't that Scripture disappeared, it was that the interpreters went asleep, right? And so what you need are genuine interpreters, and you learn from the past what really good interpretation looks like, even if you can improve on them, but you learn from that as well as from your contemporaries. So I hope that helps, though. Thank you.
All right. This gentleman up front here, this will be our last question. Yeah, she'll come down with it.
This is a question I would like to address to Dr. Zachman, especially. From your research on Martin Luther, did you see something that might have caused Luther in the last year of his life to be extremely anti-Semitic? In the last year of his life, he wrote a book, The Jews and Their Lies. This book became the spiritual inspiration of Adolf Hitler for the Holocaust in which 6 million Jews were slaughtered. Did you see this developing in Luther's life from your research in him?
No, thank you for that. And actually, that was the missing voice in this dialogue, so thank you for raising that, because that is a major issue during this period. First of all, the unfortunate story is that Luther's hardly alone. This is not to excuse him at all. It's a reprehensible history in the history of the church. And that's one of the things you learn from the history of interpretation, is just how god-awful the discussion of the Jews was from the very earliest days until 1948, right? It's enough to make you leave the church, like in a heartbeat. So the first thing to say is it's not the first and not the last of anti-Jewish polemic, but it's horrific. I mean, you're absolutely right in terms of its scale, like burning the synagogues, burning their books, exiling them from the land, taking their property because they stole it from us. What seems to have happened with Luther, he always had the same attitude toward the Jews, which is they're wrong and they need to convert, right? But he thought in 1520, when he discovered the gospel, that it would be so clear to them that that's the meaning of Hebrew scripture. Of course they wouldn't believe Rome, because Rome had perverted the gospel. But once Luther recovered the true meaning of scripture in Jesus Christ, the Jews would believe it. And not all of them would, but there would be this great conversion of Jews in Europe. And they didn't, right? They didn't believe it. They were just really glad that Luther argued, that the Jews should be left in peace in his, that Christ was born a Jew. But he thought that the preaching of the gospel would actually convert the Jews. And when they didn't convert, but instead wound up converting evangelicals who started reading Hebrew writing of the rabbis and things like that, and started observing the Sabbath, and started taking images out of churches because it violated the first, second, and third commandments, etc., then Luther became horrified that the Jews were actually winning this interpretive battle, and really became quite fearful, actually, of the influence they were having in the evangelical movement. And that it's inexcusable what he wound up concluding, but that's where the Jews and their lies came from. And it actually came from a sense of his own sense of the weakness of the evangelical movement over against his Jewish interlocutors and the people who read Jewish writing. So it's very ironic that the person who thought, you have to study Hebrew again and learn it for yourself to interpret Scripture wound up reacting to his fellow Hebraicists in this just horrific way. I don't know that it led directly to Hitler, but it was one of his favorite texts, so it certainly didn't help that was there. So, but if you look at Calvin, if you look at Erasmus, it's horrible. I mean, there's no picnic out there. Calvin says, I have often met many Jews. I have never met one Jew with any common sense at all. It's just, and he reads Jewish exegesis. He says, see what a reprobate spirit does? These people are destined for hell. So it's just like, oh my God, yeah. So I don't want to isolate Luther either, because it's a stain that goes through the whole tradition. So, but thank you for raising that.
Dr. McNutt's going to come back up and give an announcement, but let's thank our two speakers.